Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. My name is Dan Hirschman. I teach in the Sociology department here at Brown. I'll be presiding over today's event. The panel will feature 3 talks, though unfortunately our first speaker, Victor Ray, was unable to attend in person at the last moment, so I'll be trying my best to do justice to his talk. You can sort of put Victor Ray's image over me, sort of CGI, Star Wars style, and just pretend. I'll start by introducing the 3 presentations, the 3 presenters, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions after the talks. Before introducing our speakers, though, I'd like to just once again thank the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America and the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy for generously sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank my co-organizers or co-conspirators, Laura Garbez, Prabh Kahal, and Laura Lopez-Sanders. Finally, I'd especially like to thank all of the staff at CSREA, without whom none of this would be possible. Please join me in thanking Christina Down, Caitlin Murphy, and Stephanie LaRue. Our 3 presentations today, the first is by Victor Ray, who again, unfortunately can't be here. Victor is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee. He is the editor of Conditionally Accepted, an online space for scholars in the margins of academia, totally worth checking out. Along with race and organizations, Victor is sort of an expert in critical race theory. And his recent publications include a fantastic piece in sociological theory with Louise Seamster on the sort of pervasiveness and attractiveness of false racial progress narratives, along with an agenda-setting piece in the American Sociological Review on racialized organizations, about which you'll hear more in a second. Our second talk will be by Ellen Berrey, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto and an affiliate of the American Bar Foundation. I'm also contractually obligated to mention that Ellen is a Brown University alum, graduating with a degree in environmental studies. She has published 2 award-winning books. In 2015, The Enigma of Diversity, The Language of Race and the Limits of Racial Justice. And in 2017, with Robert Nelson and Laura Beth Nielsen, Rights on Trial, How Workplace Discrimination Law Perpetuates Inequality. Finally, our third speaker, Lucius Couloute, is currently completing his Ph.D. at the University of Massachusetts. Next year, he'll be an Assistant Professor of Sociology at Suffolk University. Lucius is also a policy analyst at the Prison Policy Initiative. His research and advocacy work centers on prisoner reentry, examining issues of employment and housing through the lens of race and organizations. With Melissa Wooten, he published a fantastic agenda-setting piece in Sociology Compass that argues for treating organizations themselves as having a race, and that racial stratification among organizations both mirrors and reinforces racial stratification among individuals. Very pertinent to today's conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor Ray's presentation, which is still me. So thank you all. So, on to the first presentation. Victor wanted to start off by thanking everybody. I'm not going to repeat all of that, but just say that he offers his thanks and apologies for not being able to be present. Okay. So, why don't organizational theorists, management professionals, and scholars typically call predominantly white organizations white? Predominantly white organizations are not race neutral. Like flesh-colored Band-Aids designed for white people's cuts, or nude clothing that implies only white people get naked, organizational theory implicitly assumes white organizations are the default. Scholars recognize black capitalism, black banks, and ethnic businesses, yet we think of white banks as simply just banks, and white corporations as just businesses. By only seeing race when we think about non-white organizations, white power seems natural and invisible. In a recent article in the American Sociological Review, I'm going to slip into Victor's first person now, I argue that mainstream thinking about organizations, which often assumes whiteness, contributes to the intractability of racial inequality in American organizations. Decades of anti-discrimination laws, which are often loosely enforced, and diversity policies have done little to alter the racial hierarchy in American business or the academy. By assuming race neutrality in many organizational processes, scholars and management practitioners can miss how apparently non-racial processes might nonetheless play a role in producing racially unequal outcomes. The Planning Committee asked all of us today to respond to the same prompt. In addition to understanding how race and racism operate centrally within an organization, what does a racialized organizations theory or framework reveal about organizations, and what does it suggest about how to dismantle institutional racism? They asked that I help set the stage for this discussion by laying out my racialized organizations perspective. I was happy to see this prompt because when you finish working on a paper like this one, you know really well what is left out. The implications for racial justice movements are implicit in some places, but I welcome the chance to think through these implications with you all. So then for the rest of the discussion, I'm going to focus on first describing what a racialized organization is, what racialized organizations do, and how we can intervene in racial inequality with a racialized organizations framework. To start, I define racialized organizations as meso-level social structures, limiting the personal agency and collective efficacy of subordinate racial groups, while magnifying the agency of the dominant racial group. There's a lot of jargon there, more will get explained in a second. The ability to act upon the world, to create, to learn, to express emotion, indeed one's full humanity, is constrained or enabled by racialized organizations. Racialized organizations potentially shape expressions of individual racial animus and also state policies. Following this definition, I argue that this sort of four implications flow. First, racialized organizations can enhance or diminish the agency of racial groups. Racial organizations also legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. And racial organizations promote and use whiteness as a credential. Finally, that decoupling is racialized. And again, I'll spend the rest of the talk explaining which of these means. Each of these tenets highlights the connection of ideas about race to a particular set of material and social resources as mediated by organizations. And I think seeing organizations as racial structures provides a descriptively more realistic picture of how organizations come into being, how racial hierarchies work, and how organizational processes work on their own. One way racialized organizations shape agency is by controlling time use. So we're trying to think about all the different ways that organizations sort of constrain and control who gets to act in the world. One of the important ways that organizations do this, and in a racialized fashion we don't often think about, is by controlling time use. One's location within a racialized organization influences the amount of control one exercises over your own time, your ability to plan non-work time, your ability to sort of plot out different futures. Within organizations, segregation or incorporation into the lower tiers of organizational hierarchies diminishes one's ability to influence organizational procedures and the larger organizational environment. Segregated schools make it harder for non-white children to actualize their futures. How racialized subordinates spend their time at work, in school, or at church is typically delineated by organizational procedures. For instance, non-whites are overrepresented in precarious jobs with highly variable schedules that make it difficult to manage family obligations and plan the use of their time even beyond the workplace. Organizations also shape agency through what amounts to the theft of time from non-whites. By this I mean that organizations sort of differentially apportion time along racial lines or redistribute time from non-whites to whites. Scholar Couloute, focusing on the healthcare system, argues that racial differences in life expectancy are partially produced by healthcare organizations and their practices, which means they literally steal time from black people. But Couloute's central point on the racialized apportioning of time can be generalized to organizations more broadly. Differential wages for equally qualified black and white workers, and the concentration of non-whites at the bottom of the organizational hierarchies means it takes more labor time to purchase the same necessary goods. Hiring discrimination, for example, means it takes more time to find work. And so we can think of various ways in which organizations racialize time in these different fashions. I'm going to skip the next two parts because they're not in the script. These are other things that organizations do to constrain and shape agency. Beyond shaping agency, organizations also legitimate unequally the access to resources that becomes unequal. Segregation, by design, limits access to organizational resources. Racial segregation is a defining and foundational characteristic of most organizations, historically enforced through custom, policy, and law. Segregated organizations maintain racial boundaries, channel resources, and help to direct collective action. Segregation typically means that organizations with large proportions of people of color are under-resourced relative to white organizations. Earlier scholars, such as Fraser and Marable, point to the result of this division of organizational resources. Discussing black capitalism, Fraser claimed, quote, "The total assets of all Negro banks in the United States were less than those of a single small white bank in New York." This was in 1957. Things haven't changed that much. Similarly, Marable argues that the combined assets of all black-owned businesses, this is in 2000, could be purchased by a single large oil company. This highly unequal distribution of resources continues through segregated businesses that channel money to white business owners. Black Americans regularly and often shop in white-owned stores. Often there is no other option. In contrast, segregation ensures that whites rarely shop in black businesses and are unlikely to work for black bosses. Institutionalized racial exclusion from organizations has deeply shaped the competitive environment, disadvantaging non-white organizations. Integrated organizations, those that have a mix of white and non-white workers, say, still manage to internally sort of reproduce this institutional level segregation, as racial hierarchies are mapped onto ostensibly non-racial positions. For instance, through job sorting, positions in this labor hierarchy become variously associated with racial groups and accordingly devalued or overvalued. Academic tracking stigmatizes black students by associating blackness with lower academic achievement. Even diversity programs can reinforce and legitimate racial hierarchies that they are purportedly designed to undermine. As Ellen Berrey shows, companies may see no reason to diversify workers who, quote, drove trucks, packed boxes on the factory floor, or cleaned bathrooms, as these jobs are congruent with the schemas of racial inferiority. It's important to note that some of the practices delineated above have little relation to what is typically considered illegitimate or intentional racial discrimination. In line with race-neutral sociological thinking about organizations, the operationalization of discrimination often implies kind of a discrete act, somehow otherwise separate from otherwise neutral organizational practices. Working a race-type job, though, or attending a segregated school, and the basic racial deference rituals of organizational life all reinforce the underlying connections between race and inequality without having to have any kind of explicit act of discrimination. Third point, whiteness as a credential. Whiteness works in organizations as a credential by providing access to organizational resources, legitimizing work hierarchies, and expanding white agency. This credential helps organizations appear facially neutral in principle, while in practice institutionalizing the property interest in whiteness. Credentials are allegedly objective, organizationally generated statuses showing suitability for employment and legitimating modern stratification systems. According to this narrative, credentials have replaced, in the past 100, 200 years, ascribed statuses as the legitimate bureaucratic means of allocating resources by merit. We no longer allocate resources to those who have particular statuses, but those who've achieved particular credentials. However, recent field experiments have generated some of the most important empirical evidence showing the credential value of whiteness. For example, showing that hiring discrimination could be considered a general organizational process. When discrimination is examined through audit methods, trying to isolate the racial meanings of the cause of differential treatment, we find that racialized exclusion exists across economic sectors, even when applicants are matched on formal credentials. Regardless of legal restrictions on racial discrimination, many employers are still biased against hiring people of color due to schemas, sort of conceptual understandings, related to allegedly poor work ethics or attitudes, say. Yet, despite this, researchers still continue to conceptualize credentials as race neutral. When describing the effect of racial identity on credentials, scholars operationalize discrimination as sort of different returns for the same credential. But the problem with interpreting this as a differential return is that typically perceived racial identity can even trump credentials themselves. For instance, in Diva Pager's sort of fantastic and agenda-setting research, she describes the negative credential of a criminal record. Her research shows that incarceration profoundly influences subsequent employment, but conceptualizing a criminal record as a negative credential illustrates the long-term consequences of incomplete organizational incorporation. Yet, her findings also show that blackness is itself a negative credential, as black men without criminal records were less likely to be called back for a job interview than formerly incarcerated whites. Organizational racialization is thus a credentialing process. Typically, formal credentials are considered neutral because they are bureaucratically conferred, while ascribed categories are not highly formalized, are seen as socially illegitimate means of differentiation, right? So you're allowed to use things like formal education, but it's not okay to use race or gender. But constructionist accounts of race remind us that race itself is produced precisely through these various bureaucratic procedures. For instance, the one-drop rule assigning race at birth was institutionally formalized through state laws, but applied unevenly by local organizations. Seeing racialization as a relational credentialing process kind of resonates with these broader and long-standing understandings about the social construction of race and about Harris's conception of whiteness as a form of property. Finally, the kind of fourth tenet of this approach is the idea of racialized decoupling. Racialized organizations often decouple formal commitments to equity, access, and inclusion from policies and practices that reinforce or at least do not challenge existing racial hierarchies. This is kind of a subset of the basic organizational argument that organizational policies and practices are often quite different from what organizations actually do on the ground. What Victor's pointing out is that this process works along racialized ways, and in ways that reinforce racial inequality. Objective rules and practices may be enforced in ways that disadvantage non-whites, or rules aimed at diversifying or ending discrimination may be ignored. This decoupling allows organizations to maintain legitimacy and appear neutral or even progressive, while doing little to intervene in pervasive patterns of racial inequality. Organizational rules designed to protect minority classes from discrimination are routinely broken, and racialized organizations are likely to apply rules differentially based upon the race of the rule breaker. Neo-institutional theorists have long argued that formal organizational rules are decoupled in practice. Decoupling may occur when there's a contradiction between organizational efficiency and the formal policy adopted. Maybe you adopted to placate the kind of an external constituency or something. Yet many descriptions of bureaucratic rule breaking leave out the importance of rules and hierarchy in shaping who is allowed to break the rules. In many cases, organizations adopt affirmative action policies, diversity policies, and anti-discrimination policies out of fear of government sanctions, for example, but then retroactively claim sort of benevolent intentions in so adopting. They take credit, sort of progressive credit for doing so. Diversity policies then serve a sort of ceremonial public relations function, but yet have done little to change the racial distribution of organizational power, as most diversity policies lack the formal enforcement measures that, for a short historical moment, actually made affirmative action effective. So in the 70s and early 80s, there were sort of teeth to organizational affirmative action policies. Once the sort of teeth were removed, the threat of government sanction went away, the policy stayed in the books but did very little. The decoupling was allowed to sort of go forward. Whether this lack of commitment is by design is an empirical question. However, as Bell and Partman have noted, there's an assumed white center in most discourse on diversity, with organizations expecting minorities to conform to established white norms and standards, and sort of not being willing to make deeper changes that might actually lead to a more integrated organization. So this is the broad agenda, but I think it's worth now stepping back and asking how this might change. So most of the examples I've used to illustrate the theory are about racial domination, because racial domination in organizations has been relatively constant throughout US history. But I also think by thinking about external and internal sources of change and the way that organizations use race, we can develop strategies to minimize or reduce racial inequality. Take, for instance, social movement actions such as the Montgomery bus boycott, which have cleverly used organizational resources to help change the racial order. Similarly, movement actors entering organizations with the hope of transforming them have also, to some extent, altered how organizations use race. That said, I think it's important to think about racial contestation as a continual process. I'm thinking here of historian Ibrahim Kendi's work, and especially his quip, there has been racial progress, but there has also been racist progress. That is, the technologies of racism, both organizational and societal, have continued changing right alongside progressive pushback to create racial progress. When organizations are pushed to be more racially inclusive, they are likely to push back. I'm going to end here, and I look forward to hearing my co-panelists and the subsequent discussion. Thank you very much. And next up is Ellen Berrey. Right?
Yeah. We're going to change.
Oh.
We're going to change things up.
Do you want?
I don't care. No, whoever wants next.
I don't want to go after Elliot. Okay, so I'm not going to use any slides. I'm going to force you all just to kind of stare at me. So really honored to be here. Thank you to everyone who was involved for inviting me to take part on this panel. It's really sort of awesome to be part of this growing community of scholars who are investigating race and racism in organizations. And so I think what we're sort of being able to do, or what we're doing now, is sort of really trying to sort of connect the macro to the micro in ways that are a bit more concrete than in the past. And so what I mean by this is often when we talk about racism, for example, there are kind of these two frames that we often employ. What I would call racism small, those sort of micro-interactional, isolated incidences of racial animus. So this is often what is discussed in the general public or in the media. And then as sociologists, I think we often talk about racism big, those kind of structural racisms that kind of exist everywhere and operate to disadvantage people of color and privileged white folks. But so while these ideas about racism are certainly valid, by and large, I think we've sort of lacked a unified middle ground that specifies the kind of generic processes that actually do the sort of racist thing and result in the racist outcomes. So enter the study of race in organizations, right? And not that it's new, but I think that it's really starting to sort of grow. And so since basically everything kind of happens in organizations, right? We're mostly born in them. We go to schools in them. We go to work in organizations. We're arrested by organizations. Well, some of us are arrested by organizations. We die in organizations, or when we die, organizations handle our funeral, right, our insurance. Organizations have a lot to do with how and when we die, right? So it's important that we recognize how racism actually flows through and within organizations, these sort of collective entities that have the power to shape our social world. And so I often think about this Stokely Carmichael quote, and it goes, "If a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he's got the power to lynch me, that's my problem." And he went on to talk about capitalism, but for me it also points to how organizations have the power to allow or restrict the behavior of individuals. Organizations have the power to sort people, to determine opportunity and resource flows, to establish acceptable boundaries around ideas, right? So when Eric Garner is killed for selling cigarettes, it's not just an instance of hate or just these sort of broad ideas around blackness and criminality alone. It's the mapping of those ideas around blackness and criminality onto organizational practices like broken windows policing, lack of police accountability, hiring and use of force practices, a legal apparatus that consistently serves to kind of fail black communities through these overbroad prosecutorial discretion or jury selection procedures. These are the things that sort of produce that racist system, right? And so my point is that contemporarily, racism survives largely because of racist organizational practices, that these racist organizational practices survive. And so I think that Victor's recent ASR piece in particular helps us understand how this kind of happens. So while we have racism big and racism small, I think focusing on organizations gets us to racism perpetuated. Through mechanisms like decoupling, like credentialing, credentialization, so on and so forth. And so much of my work is kind of interested in understanding how constellations of social actors, like organizations, operate collectively to produce racist systems, particularly as this pertains to the process that we often call prisoner reentry. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But I largely think in terms of organizational fields, and partly that's because I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Melissa Wooten, who has really done an amazing job, I think, at intentionally creating a community of scholars who, for the last years, have sort of met to discuss issues related to race and organizations. And so in a paper that we co-authored, we talk about the case of HBCUs, right, and how they were excluded from state financial backing that was really enjoyed by white colleges and universities. But because, like individuals, HBCUs were racialized as black, which now and then really meant being cast as less than, as inferior institutions of higher learning, despite producing amazing undergraduate thinkers, for example, like Du Bois. And I don't know if any of you have watched Homecoming, Beyonce's documentary, right? Like producing that kind of black excellence, like that takes a lot, right? But anyway, so just as individuals can be excluded from social resources and opportunities like jobs and decent pay, so can organizations. Black student unions and cultural centers, indeed entire academic units like ethnic studies and Afro-Am departments continue to feel this kind of racialization today. But again, this racializing is impacted by broader organizational infrastructures, colleges, legislatures, boards of ed, for example, who by transferring racial ideas onto racial practices kind of met out racism at the meso level. And so this brings me to the issue of prisoner reentry, or what we call prisoner reentry, because in truth, many people who are released from prison never really had entry into society in the first place. Prior to incarceration, most of the people I study grew up in poverty-stricken, segregated, and disproportionately policed neighborhoods. They went to under-resourced and increasingly disciplinary schools. They never received the kind of physical and mental health services that middle-class white folks enjoy. They were systemically excluded from stable and well-paying jobs that might lead to the middle class. So formerly incarcerated people of color were never integrated into society to begin with, and this in turn leads to criminal justice contact. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with $1 million blocks, but in some communities, over $1 million a year is allocated to police and incarcerate people from single neighborhood blocks, right? And so this doesn't happen in white communities, right? Practices like stop and frisk, for example, just sort of doesn't happen in white communities. And by the way, stop and frisk is really a failed sort of practice, right? If the goal is to get contraband or to get guns, it's a failed practice. But if the goal is to treat black people as dangerous, to inform communities that black people are dangerous, then it's a pretty useful practice for the police. But these police forces who are focused on the punitive containment of black communities operate very much as racialized and racializing organizations, white-dominated and seeking to dominate black communities, using practices that really would be unthinkable in white communities, despite the fact that, for example, blacks and whites are not using drugs at dissimilar rates. So it's not about the attitude of individual cops, but is instead about the sort of organizational power to define, to segregate, to distribute disciplinary power. But okay, so people get arrested, and then they're locked up in jail, right? And presumably assumed not guilty until they're actually convicted. And then they can typically get out if they have the money to pay bail. But disproportionately, this means that poor people of color languish away in jail because they simply don't have the money, right? I had one respondent tell me about how he spent a year in jail before his case eventually got dropped because he lacked the money to pay bail. So this is not an atypical kind of thing. And I mentioned overbroad prosecutorial power, which is really about the ability of prosecutors to choose who, when, and how to prosecute with little oversight. And the fact that, over time, prosecutors have increasingly become more punitive and have increasingly charged people with longer sentences, which is part of the reason so many poor people of color take plea deals. People are scared of going to prison for decades, and because most do not have the wealth to afford expensive lawyers, they take these sort of plea deals most of the time, in fact, about 90–95% of the time. And we know that blacks tend to go away to prison for longer than whites, even when they've committed the same crimes. A U.S. Sentencing Commission report basically just came out and sort of reinforced this fact. And much of this centers on how court and prosecutors' offices conduct business, privileging those with more resources and disadvantaging those with less. All right, and so then people are incarcerated. Well, what do you know? The prison is a racialized organization. So black people make up about 13% of the overall population, but prisons are about 40% black, 40%, right? And we know that black incarcerated people are treated differently, more likely to be put in solitary confinement, less likely to be paroled. And a lot of this is due to sort of the discretionary bias of correctional officers and parole boards. And some prisons explicitly sort and segregate incarcerated people according to race, which kind of hardens the connection between certain identities like blackness or Latino-ness and criminality. And so the carceral apparatus in many ways gives us clear examples of how organizational resources can be used to categorize and sort individuals on the basis of race. And so finally we get to reentry. And so people are released, and then what happens? Well, most experience not an escape from organizational control, but rather a sort of transfer in kind. And so leaving the prison organization often means entering another or multiple others, such as the parole office, the halfway house, the shelter, the training program, the employer. But this can also mean the exclusion from these organizations. So in some of my research using the Bureau of Justice Statistics data, I found that unemployment among formerly incarcerated people is up over 27%. So these are people who have been to prison and want but cannot find jobs. And the rate is even higher for people of color. So black men who have been to prison experience 35% unemployment, and black women who have been to prison are unemployed at a rate of about 40%, 40%. So the question becomes why, right? Why such high rates of unemployment, particularly among black ex-prisoners? Well, organizations put up some really steep barriers for this population. We've all seen that sort of little question on an application, on a job application that asks if you've had a criminal record, asks you to kind of check that box. The question alone discourages people with criminal records from applying because it kind of sends the message that you're different, right? That you're dangerous, that you are not fit to be grouped with other applicants. And as Victor argues, the criminal record operates as this negative credential, right? Signaling to employers that you are unsuitable. But here's the rub. So in places where they've implemented ban the box so that employers cannot ask about somebody's criminal record on the initial application, we're finding that ban the box actually promotes this kind of statistical discrimination against black people, right? So in the absence of an ability to ask about criminal records, employers are using blackness as a proxy for criminalness, for criminality. And so this kind of connection between blackness and perceived criminality is nothing new. So I think of Khalil Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is really something I recommend you all read. But he talks about how social scientists participated in the criminalization of black people through the misuse of statistical data, promoting this idea that black people are inherently immoral. And today these kind of ideas continue to exist, but more importantly, they're mapped onto organizational hiring practices that lead to inequalities in unemployment rates. And so I had one respondent, he was a black man, and he was recounting his experience trying to get a job. He said, I went to a bread shop the other day, and they got a big sign, hiring, need people immediately. So I go in, of course, and I ask for an application, and as I get the application, she looks at me and she says, well, you know we do full background checks. This is not equal opportunity. So if you have a felony on your record, you might not even want to take the application. And so he hadn't told this person that he had a criminal record. She just assumed that he did based on his presentation, right? So criminal records as negative credentials, but blackness as a negative credential at the sort of first stage of the application process before he even got to apply. So there are all these kind of layers of personal bias and discretion, formal rules that are race neutral on face, but racialized in practice, thinking about felony exclusion and decoupling. And so this is how racialized organizations distribute and sort opportunities. But despite these racialized practices, reentry organizations, or the ones that I studied, largely operate under a framework of colorblindness. So that when black ex-prisoners recidivate more often than whites, or when black ex-prisoner unemployment rates far outpace white unemployment rates, my interviews with reentry professionals suggest that this is largely perceived as a product of motivational differences. Who is willing to put in the most effort? And so I often ask parole officers and other case managers and reentry professionals if they know about Diva Pager's work. And I'm sure if any of you are sociologists, you definitely do. But of course, none of them have even remotely come across this study or any of this data. And so part of it is certainly the disconnect between research and practice. But it's also because most reentry systems are kind of set up to further discipline ex-prisoners, not to reduce the organizational barriers to jobs or apartments, for example. It's why POs like some in my sample can say that it's not the criminal record that holds people back, it's the lack of motivation. And so when labor market exclusions for black or brown ex-prisoners are interpreted by probation and parole as personal failures, what you have is this kind of cognitive schema that justifies racial inequalities as the outcome of non-racial dynamics. You have this colorblind reentry system. And so to get back to the questions, I know I've kind of taken you a few different places, but I'd say a racialized organization's framework forces us to understand that racist systems require vessels. Vessels which kind of do the racist things. They sort people into positions, allocate resources, hoard opportunities based on race. And then regarding the question of what a racialized organization's framework suggests about dismantling institutional racism, I think it helps us better focus on the culprits. Those organizational vessels who employ tangible practices and policies that can actually change. Now, actually getting them to change, and whether this is catalyzed from within or without, as Victor's presentation kind of talked about or illustrated, that's another discussion. But at least we have the proper focus, right? The proper target. So it's not just that we have bad cops who kill unarmed black people, it's that we have bad cops who kill unarmed black people who are supported by a thin blue line, years of police militarization, zero departmental accountability, a powerful prosecutor's office that works suspiciously close with the police departments. And so now we attack these kind of organizational sources of inequality rather than blaming it on a few bad apples or some overly broad concept of structure without the actual scaffolding, right? So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I want to add that Lucius defended his dissertation just like in the last breath, I think, before coming here. So let's just say, Dr. Couloute, woo! Yay. All right.
Light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Great. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for having me here. It is such a treat to be part of this intellectual community and to have everybody here in attendance, to be part of the conversation. And as Dan mentioned, I'm an alum from the mid-90s, and so I would just say life goals is giving a talk at Brown. So here we are. So it's very exciting for me to be in this conversation right now, specifically because I'm at the conceptual stage of a brand new project, and I mean like brand new as in the last 3 to 4 weeks project, which I'll be talking about today. And I'm also at the stage of modestly reconceptualizing another project in progress. So this is a really fun opportunity for me to think about this framework of racialized organizations and how can I put them to work in my own research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research to date on racism, organizations, law in the context of higher education. And then I'm going to move to some questions I have about a racialized organizations framework. Then I'm going to try to use some of that to launch into thinking about my very new project, and then close with some takeaways. So all of this is with the goal of advancing the study of racialized organizations, speaking to Victor's important work that Lucius has done with Melissa Wooten, who really laid the groundwork and made some very bold and kind of statements in pushing our thinking forward. And it's always easier to critique ideas than to come up with your own new good ideas. So I'm mindful of doing that, but I also have some things I want to push on, focusing specifically on the framework that Victor lays out for us. I also will say this is not like any other formal talk I've given before, and that I'm talking about empirical content that I'm new to, and applying a framework that I'm still learning. Victor's article came out in the last month or two, right? So I haven't had as much time to digest. So you're going to hear me. Mostly this is like a lot of questions from me as opposed to a lot of answers is what you're going to get. All right. So in The Enigma of Diversity, in my first book, I look at the push for diversity, the rhetoric on diversity, the diversity policies, programs, practices that have become so pervasive in American organizations. And the book asks, is this push for diversity, is this a win for the civil rights movement, or is this a watering down of those more radical aims of racial justice? So 2 of the cases, one's a university, one's a company, or large bureaucracies, and then the other one is a neighborhood, but I was looking at the organizations within that neighborhood, so very, very organization-centric. And in the book, I, like many of us, note that we're missing this meso-level analysis of race and racism and how they operate through organizations, that we have this work at the macro level, at the micro level, but there's not enough happening at the level of organizations. And so that's not where I want to go. One of the arguments I make there is that many organizations have constructed these identities based on the idea of diversity. And that is this mechanism where ideas of race become consequential for organizational practice. But unlike Lucius and Victor and Melissa Wooten and others, in the book I don't try to theorize that relationship between race and organizations. To put this in a little bit of a broader context, if we think about the campus politics of diversity and racial justice in the 21st century, in very kind of broad brushstrokes, biased toward my research interests, we can think about universities as racialized institutions, characterized by racial hierarchies in, for example, the racialized bodies who inhabit them, who are admitted in. This is very different in universities across the larger field of higher education, which is very stratified by race, by class, by prestige, but overwhelmingly at the most selective schools, our student bodies, our faculties, our administrations are overwhelmingly white. We've seen over decades now the institutionalization of diversity policies and programs. What I write about is an organizational infrastructure of diversity that functions to, among other things, selectively integrate limited numbers of people of color into predominantly white environments without much change to the status quo. And the most well-known of these policies, and the most contentious ones, are affirmative action in admissions. So affirmative action policies are policies where people making admissions decisions will consider an applicant's racial identity, if they're Black, Latino, or Indigenous, for the purposes of trying to improve representation, numerical representation of those groups. So affirmative action is, for all its attention, it's very small scale. It's not used at most schools. It's really an addendum to a much larger system of wealth and white preferences that just shapes who gets into a university. Affirmative action has been contentious because it's got opponents who are mobilized and resourced. So part of this larger legal conservative movement that's been building over decades has been to mount successful state-level campaigns to ban affirmative action. So now 25% of high school students are in states where affirmative action is banned, and have filed litigation based on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, saying that considering race in admissions is a violation of our individual right to be treated as individuals, not as members of racial groups. So universities have opted to defend affirmative action in court on the grounds of diversity, and pulling on decades of legal argument of the diversity rationale. And this is that argument, sort of very instrumental thinking. It's not that we're saying we're doing affirmative action to create racial equality. It's not saying we're doing affirmative action so we have more Black doctors. It's saying we're doing affirmative action because it's good for everyone, that we have better learning for everyone in the student body, that it's good for businesses, it's good for national security, it's good for the economy. So this is diversity rhetoric is not just in the realm of law. It's, as I write about, institutionalized in many organizations' identities. Where it gets affirmed as a value that is not, but is not a radical transformation that would undermine the foundations of organizational whiteness and white advantage that enables. At the same time, as Dan and I have documented in our work, there's been a massive retreat away from affirmative action across the field of higher education. So in 1994, 60% of selective schools used an affirmative action policy, and 20 years later, only 35% did. So the most prestigious schools held on to affirmative action, but massive drop-off throughout the spectrum. And I'm continuing to explore that work with Prabh Kahal and Dan as well. So in the last 5 years, we've seen this kind of burgeoning of student mobilization around anti-racism. Much of that organizing has been precipitated or triggered by pervasive, kind of mundane racism on campus that students of color experience, whether it's outright antagonism or microaggressions, students of color experiencing particularly on predominantly white campuses from their white peers, white faculty. On more than 90 campuses, and in the fall of 2015, students announced demands asking administrations for better curricula, for more support, for more minority faculty. And there are connections between this organizing, I believe, and the Black Lives Matter movement in many kind of ways. Connections that we'll talk hopefully more about tomorrow in the workshop that I'm doing on the paper. But for example, of the more than 90 schools where students posted demands, 6 of those were in Missouri, and the University of Missouri was the epicenter of the activism, and that's just a couple hours from Ferguson, right? So this is not just in higher education. There is this overlap beyond the campus walls. Oh, that's not what I want. Okay, so we've also seen this resurgence in national politics of overt white nationalism elevated to the highest level of government. We've seen, with help from the conservative legal movement, the institutionalization of conservative judges and courts, probably one of the greatest victories, successes, I would say, of the Trump administration that will matter for generations. And we've seen a ramping up of a long-standing conservative antagonism against higher education institutions that are seen as bastions of liberalism. So not the for-profit schools, but, and this has been that antagonism is most consequential for the public universities that are starved for resources. So since writing of Enigma of Diversity, I've been thinking a lot about the interaction between social movements and organizations around racial issues. So how have students and external actors mobilized to pressure universities? How have universities responded? What are the outcomes of those mobilizations? Are they changing institutions or not? So I think we can use a racialized organization's perspective to better understand the relational dynamics between social movements, organizations, and the political environment by looking at higher education. So before I get into more of the details of that, I want to just pose some questions about advancing the study of race in organizations. These are not questions, these are more points. One of them is that one of the things I really like about the racialized organization's perspective is that it seems to me that this comes out of the experience that many people of color have in white organizations when looking around and thinking, oh my gosh, this place is so white, right? You can think of the corollaries where women have this and in organizations dominated by men. Queer people have this in organizations dominated by straight people. So kind of the analogy goes on. So at the risk of sounding too technical, though, I want to know kind of how do you know a racialized organization when you see it? Like, what are the empirical signs that there's a racialized organization? In some ways, I think here I'm really cueing into the idea of like calling an organization white. Like, that's a white organization. So how do you know that? How do you get to decide that? So pulling from research from Berrey and Wooten and Couloute, they point to a number of these. One of them they say is to understand if an organization is racialized or not if it's not, because I think we're saying all organizations are racialized, how it's racialized. We want to think about its context. What are the regimes of inequality that it's embedded in? What's the historical imprint on that organization in terms of its geographic location, of its place in the economy? We want to think about who are the racialized bodies and where are they in the hierarchy of the organization? We want to look at what are the racialized meanings that have currency and what are the racialized practices that form what Melissa and Lucius write about as these repertoires of practice, of strategy. So two of the ones that came up repeatedly, I'm referring here, if you're not familiar with this, to two of the readings that we were encouraged to read for today, were organizations when they have explicit racial criteria, like an affirmative action policy, or when looking at the practices that are unmarked but either normatively racial or racially consequential. Also, Victor elaborates kind of the dynamic of racialized schemas, which I think it might be easier to think about these as institutional logics if we want to get technical, but that and the resource distribution, who gets to shape our understandings, patterned understandings, and the ways that the resources we have for running organizations. Right. So a bunch of questions that this raises for me, like, is there an order of importance? Like, does anything matter more or less? How do we, if we're talking about racialized bodies, how do we differentiate the bodies from the organization? Like, how many white bodies do you have to have a white institution? I think that's kind of an annoying question, but it is really something I've been thinking about. Like, how do you classify like a city council or a government department where Black people have a very sizable representation, or like Columbia University, where the undergraduate student body, a third of the students are white identified Americans, right? So, but I think we would say probably Columbia is a white university, but how do we get our heads around these organizations that are maybe not so clearly, at least in terms of the bodies who inhabit it, white? How do we make sense of this for very large, complex organizations that have multiple units and, from the human resources department to the factory to who's, cutting the lawn? Like that, can we label that whole organization a race? And I guess I wonder, like, what's the value? It's so hard even just to decide, like, to designate an individual as belonging to a racial group. Like, who gets to decide someone's racial identity? And that is research on an individual's racial identity shows that people's identity, how they define themselves, changes over time. People change what they think their race is, and other people don't always agree on somebody's race when they're trying to decide what that person's race is. So that's just for one person who has these the meaningless but meaningful indicators of skin color and hair type, for example. So calling something a white organization, I think, is like linguistically convenient, but I kind of wonder about analytic precision with that. Not something I'll get to today, but I kind of thinking about how do we take this framework that's really kind of depends on knowing a lot about an organization, and how do you use that for quantitative research when you don't know very much about the organizations you're studying? And what do we do about when there's competing claims? How do we make sense of the competing claims on how an organization is racialized? All right. Also pushing for this study, I've been thinking a lot about how do we, with this framework, think about relationships and how do we think about change. And this is, again, sort of keying in, especially on Victor's points about social movements. And so Victor calls for scholars to theorize changes in how organizations are racialized, recognizing that changes are often prompted by external pressures on them. And as he writes, quote, social movements are perhaps the clearest attempts to alter racialized organizations and institutionalize racial concerns. So with that understanding, and this is keying into work that Lucius and Melissa have done as well, is that we need to, or building on their work rather, is we need to account for the institutional fields and the relational dynamics that racialized organizations are embedded in. So here I'm borrowing some tenets from organizational research. Like if the move that Victor's doing in his work is saying we have to bring in the organizations, then I'm saying like we have to bring in the fields, right? Those of you who know sociology, these will sound like familiar things to say. So in some ways this is predictable. But there's been a move within organizational sociology of at least the last 20, 30 years of saying we should not be looking at organizations as disembodied entities, as units, but we need to locate them within the broader fields and the relationships that define them. And especially if we want to explain how organizations change. So lots of different ways to do this. There's always a risk of having a really long list of how you're supposed to look at fields, but keying on some work done by sociologists on looking at how social movements and organizations intersect, I've been thinking about how can we think about racialized organizations in terms of who's dominant in the organization and who's challenging it, right? Like what are those historical racialized relationships where universities, for example, are relating to activists, for example? How do we think about the governance administration of organizations as it relates to other entities? Where's the decision-making made? Who's funding, for example, with universities? Who's funding the university? We think about state legislators. We want to think about alumni. We want to think about the Koch brothers, for example, students. Who are the networks that are involved? What are the prevailing logics, the discourses and framings? How can we bring forward some understandings, especially in the work of Don Thomas Kubik-Devi and Dustin Avant-Holt, about mechanisms of organizational inequality? And how can we think some more about, like, what are the destabilizing events that can occur that within a field that lead different organizations to react and can lead to a realignment of that field. So again, not a super parsimonious list that I have here, but kind of formulaic, but these are some ways of thinking, kind of concepts putting out there, not my own, but for thinking about field level change. And so hopefully when we think about racialized organizations as nested within racialized fields of action, we can see the way racialization works more clearly. We can understand change better. All right. Always a problem with this kind of approach is like, where's the end of the analysis? When are you going to stop doing research? So anyway, that's just something to play with. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to putting some of these ideas together with this new project I've started with Liliana Garces, who's at University of Texas, Austin, and where we're looking at how universities are managing hate speech, or what we're thinking of as overt hateful expression. So I'm beginning with some disturbing content. I won't leave this up there for too long. But there's long been overt hate speech on university campuses, but been a real increase with Trump's election. So between fall 2016, fall 2017, the Anti-Defamation League found an increase of 258% of these kinds of incidents. about half of them, so between those 2 school years, 2016, 2017, the Anti-Defamation League recorded more than 450 incidents of hate speech. And about half of them were flyers, like the kind we see here, from white supremacist organizations trying to do recruitment, kind of under this kind of the stated goal of preserving white culture. So these can range from kind of overt propaganda that's clearly kind of explicitly hateful toward blacks, Jews, Muslims, non-white immigrants, people who are LGBTQ+, or more veiled calls for white identity. All right. So these kind of flyers are legally protected. This is entirely lawful under the First Amendment, so long as there's no true threat. For analytic purposes, they become interesting because they're legally protected, because they are, and they're uniquely contentious, and from many of us, clearly a problem. But also I want to say I recognize that I'm sort of decontextualizing them from the microaggressions, from the kind of everyday aggressions, from racialized violence against people of color that in our lived experiences, these aren't divorced, but under under law, they're unique. So Liliana and I are asking, how do racialized universities manage these expressions of overt hate? How do they understand them as free speech or not? And how do those understandings become informative of their diversity policies and programs? And then ultimately, kind of what does this mean for marginalized students, especially students of color, and their experience on campus? So if we think about the field of activity here, we have students of color and students of other marginalized groups coping and contesting. So as targets of hate speech, as witnesses to hate speech, there are racialized consequences for racialized bodies, where there are mental health risks, psychiatric symptoms, academic underperformance, and other complex coping strategies. There's been social movement mobilization around this issue, but there's been less activism, specifically kind of the activism challenging anti-black racism since the rise of Trump, it seems. It looks like kind of the protest dynamics have shifted more toward immigration, issues of immigration. Okay, then we have kind of the construction of a free speech crisis by the far right. So these are almost entirely white, male-dominated organizations, political entities, pundits, news organizations, that's not news, media organizations, provocateurs, sort of decrying the campus PC police, both administrations and students as snowflakes who allegedly won't allow for conservative voices. So just in the last few weeks, Trump signed an executive order about campus free speech, threatening to punish colleges if they don't guarantee free speech. And 15 states have passed laws that ostensibly are about protecting free speech, which is really driven by a concern that conservative speakers are not getting platforms on college campuses. Okay, we've seen enough of those. So if we think about universities' responses as being racialized institutions, and as predominantly white racialized institutions, there's been a lot of different courses of action, a lot of denial, a lot of inaction, a lot of affirmation of diversity and the value of free speech in the face of these contests. Liliana's been studying administration at University of Texas, Austin, where she's finding that the administration has really kind of fall back on this argument of we don't censor, it's not okay to censor, right? That's just kind of falling into kind of the absolutist understanding of the First Amendment. We've seen universities go into crisis management mode, concerned about their public relations, and then adopting some policies like speech codes. These date back for decades. And more recently, kind of what's come in the spotlight are bias response teams, which I'll come back to. So one of the most important things that social movements can do is to change the way we think about an issue. And we've seen this certainly in this context. So we have these sort of framing or discourse contests. Our colleges bastions of liberal intolerance, attacking free speech, or there's pushback, saying that this is not free speech, this is about bigots trying to normalize hate. So here's this contestation over what is actually racialized, right? And how do we define something that's racialized? That I think becomes an important part of the analysis. Although we as analysts are saying things are racialized, we also need to be analyzing how the people we're studying think things are racialized, and where they insist they're racialized, and who's insisting they're racialized, and who's not. All right, back to this slide. There's also been free speech advocacy. I don't really want to use that term. I'm going to call it First Amendment advocacy or individual rights advocacy from organizations. Some ideological diversity there, but these are predominantly white organizations that have really zoned in specifically on the bias response teams. And if we think about this as kind of the evolution from affirmative action, we've gone from a policy, an attack that's saying schools are not following the 14th Amendment, to now an attack saying the schools are not following the First Amendment. That by trying to do something to protect students of color, to make campuses more inclusive, you are violating free speech. And so these bias response teams are policies that universities have to respond to students' reports or witnesses' reports of acts, of offensive acts. Not a ton of research on them, but they've gotten a lot of attention. It's sort of like they've got that nefarious word, like the bias response team is coming. So that kind of the embodiment of the PC police. So we can think about these legal challenges, though, as a colorblind attack on an inclusionary program that can serve a goal of white supremacy, even if that's not the intent of how these organizational actors understand what they're doing. But we also don't, I think, want to become too defensive of universities, because there's real questions about, are these bias response teams anything but window dressing? They seem to be really organized toward helping the target through the experience, as opposed to changing the underlying conditions that led to the bias. All right. So, I've been trying to think about kind of how do we take racialized organizations, and to what extent does that framework stay useful when we shift out to the field level? And one thing after reading this work, as I'm thinking, as Liliana and I are deciding the design of our study, I think we need to look at an HBCU in our university cases. I emailed that to her this morning. We'll see what she says. But in thinking about how universities are responding. So in terms of takeaways, again, this question of what's the leverage we get by designating an organization as a racialized entity, and when is it more useful maybe to look at racialized processes. Saying, I want some more nuance in terms of the parameters of an organization, what decides its whiteness. And I want to be careful that we're not determining the significance of racialization, because not everything may be, not everything. How we think about racialization in relation to kind of organizational functions, the other things that organizations are trying to get done. How can we use a field level analysis to be more sensitive to some of these dynamics, while recognizing that racialization is going to be contentious? And then lastly, this work has really been developed in thinking about how we advance race scholarship. And I've been wondering, what are the paths for people who are more interested in organizations or more interested in social movements, who are trying to answer different kind of questions about how organizations change, or how do people mobilize? And is an idea of a racialized organization going to be useful in that context? So I'll stop there.